Alright guys, welcome, and today we're going to take a look at how the United States is transitioning now into the 19th century with the transition from John Adams into the presidency of Jefferson. And throughout the course here in our period 4, we're going to take a look at the Democratic Republicans' control of the presidency through Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Quincy Adams, and then eventually into Andrew Jackson, the Democratic Party. So let's go ahead and get started. The 1800 election is going to be a huge turning point in U.S. history. When I say that, it will also spawn the 12th Amendment, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. This revolution of 1800 is going to mark the first time that political power transitions from one party to another, because John Adams, being a member and leader of the Federalist Party, is going to lose his seat to the upcomer Thomas Jefferson of the Democratic Republicans, and we've talked at length about the differences in the views of government and so forth between the two parties. If you look here, we can see kind of the way that the election goes in 1800, very different from that of 1796, where Adams had narrowly won. We see here that Jefferson wins as well, with a 53 to 47 advantage, and we can see huge amounts of control in the southern and western parts as well. Again, the reason why this election is so important or so monumental is because it does switch powers to the Democratic Republican Party, and will basically phase out and cause the end of the Federalist Party. And John Adams will be the last Federalist president, and we'll see that even across the board in the House of Representatives and the Senate, the Federalists lose their control in the national government. And it'll eventually get to the what is known today as the modern Democratic Party, where we have Andrew Jackson will come in the late 1820s after the presidency of John Quincy Adams, which we'll get to towards the end of our unit. Alright, so what I want you to do, I want you to go ahead and pause this video here in just a second, and I want you to answer this question. If this image captures Jefferson's vision of an ideal America, what was his vision? What role did Jefferson want the government to play in this ideal America? So think back to what we talked about as far as the differences between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. So go ahead, pause this video, and then go ahead and hit play once you're done answering those questions. Alright, so hopefully, from what you saw there with the yeoman farmer, some of the things you might have jotted down about what Jefferson wanted was that he wanted to minimize the size and cost of the federal government. He wants a small federal government where the states have more power. He wants to reverse a lot of the Federalist policies. He believes the government has grown too large and powerful in all three branches, but especially that in the executive branch here with the White House, and he wants to limit the power of the federal government. He wants to cut the size of the military. He is more of a pacifist or an isolationist than that of the Federalist Party. He wants to eliminate taxes on whiskey, slaves, and property. Remember, he is supporting the southern states more than the north, so of course he wants to eliminate those taxes that would impact the southern states more than that of the north. He also wants to get out of this Bank of the United States. Remember, he believes via the strict construction of the Constitution that bank is unconstitutional and should not be allowed to exist, and he wants to focus on paying down the federal government's debt. So he believes, if we look back at this picture, he believes that America should be an agrarian republic where people are mostly farmers, not this industrialized society that the North is trying to promote or that Europe is trying to promote during the Industrial Revolution. And he believes that if this is able to be possible, that it will force the national government to protect the liberty of the farmers, because they won't need a strong centralized government. But the Federalists do not see it this way. Okay, the Federalists see it the complete opposite. They are going to favor a strong central government, and they want to destroy the yeoman farmer mentality of that of the Democratic Republicans. Remember the economic systems that were promoted by Alexander Hamilton, where he wanted to increase tariffs, increase taxes to pay for the federal government. He wanted to keep a debt so that way investors could feel like they could make money off of that debt, and it would support his economic policies. But the Federalist policies are going to tend to take a back step during this time period here with Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. So let's go ahead and recap real quick the Adams presidency, or kind of wrap up the Adams presidency, because the last time we talked about him, we talked about the XYZ affair with the Alien Sedition Acts, and that was basically it. So with the Adams presidency, sometimes the time period after an election, the last month or two of a presidency who's losing his seat, is called a lame duck term, because you know that you're not going to be elected again, or you're not going to be able to continue your term. Therefore, you do things you normally would not do because you don't have to worry about being reelected. And one of the things that Adams is going to do is he's going to appoint numerous Federalists to the judges in Supreme Court, and he's going to do this on the last day of his presidency, and they are going to be called midnight judges. Remember, he wants to try to keep the Federalists in the Supreme Court and in the federal court system as long as he can, because he knows the Democratic Republicans are gaining popularity. Of course, if you're Jefferson, you're going to oppose these appointments because it's going to make your job even harder, because the whole purpose of the federal government, or the federal courts and the Supreme Court, is to judge on a constitutionality of acts or legislation that's being passed. So Jefferson does not want these Federalists to be in his way, so he can promote that Democrat-Republican system of government. Some of these he's even going to deny the appointments, and Madison is going to deny one of these potential judges was William Marbury. And when William Marbury was informed that he was not going to get the judgeship that was offered to him under President Adams, he's going to sue the federal government for what he believes is his rightfully earned position. And that this court case is one to make sure that you remember, because I guarantee that it's going to be on your final exam at some level. This Marbury versus Madison, and it's going to be one of the most important Supreme Court cases in U.S. history. We'll talk about the different sides here in class. We'll go through and talk about what John Marshall believes the Supreme Court judge's job should be, and how it kind of changes the judicial branch going forward. So in the case of Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court will rule that the President's decision to deny Marbury of his appointment did not violate the Constitution. Therefore, Marbury was not going to get the judgeship that he was promised under Adams. So even though he is suing the government, he is not going to get his position, and the Supreme Court rules in favor of Jefferson and Madison. And the reason that this court case is so important is not because of Marbury not being able to get his spot on the court. It's more because of what it sets a precedent for what the Supreme Court is able to do moving forward. And as far as declaring acts to be unconstitutional, William Marshall, who was the Chief Justice at the time, we'll talk about him in just a second, is going to deem that it is the Supreme Court's purpose to make sure that certain things are constitutional or not. So even though John Marshall sides with Marbury personally and believes that he should be a judge because he was appointed a judge, and he is also a Federalist himself, he cannot legally believe that Madison or that Marbury has the right to sue the federal government for his job, and that Madison and Jefferson have every right within their power, the Constitution, to deny him his spot. So here real quick is a rundown of kind of John Marshall's legacy that he leaves behind after over 30 years on the Supreme Court as a Chief Justice. And you can see here all the different court cases. We've already talked about Marbury versus Madison, and throughout this period that we're going to talk about, we'll see where he was important or vital in McCulloch versus Maryland, or Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, or Gibbons versus Ogden, and how all these kind of court cases moved the country going forward or changed policy in the United States moving forward. So as you can see here on the map down here in the bottom left corner, we can see that during Jefferson's presidency, the U.S. population is going to grow dramatically, and there's a lot of people who are moving out of the East Coast into the West, in present-day Tennessee, in present-day Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, Mississippi, Louisiana, and that benefits Thomas Jefferson. He's going to support these states because they primarily support Democratic Republican policies. Kentucky will become a state. Tennessee, Ohio, they will all be added into the Union. But Jefferson was worried about French control of New Orleans and the Mississippi River at this time. So he is going to try to figure out a way to kind of annex or add these places into the United States as well. So what Jefferson is going to do, he's going to send a delegate or a representative to France to negotiate with Napoleon because he wants to add this Louisiana territory to the United States. And Napoleon at this point is going through and he's raiding Europe and he's going through a whole bunch of wars with either Prussia, Austria, England, and so forth, and he needs cash. So it works out for both of them that we're going to get in 1803 the purchase of the Louisiana territory known as Louisiana Purchase. And as you can see here on the map, it will double the size of the U.S. Country. So now all of this territory is controlled by the United States. You can see that Britain still has a piece of Canada, and then Spain in the southwest part of the continent, and then also Florida. The Americans were first excited about gaining this new western lands, but it did present some problems for them. Remember, Jefferson is a strict constitutional person. He believes that you should only give the national government the right to do what is strictly defined in the Constitution. But there's a problem. There is nowhere in the Constitution that gives him the right to purchase land. So Jefferson has to figure out, how am I going to make this constitutional, even though he does believe in strict interpretation. And he's going to use that elastic clause. He's going to use that term of loose conscription that the Federalists had used during Washington's presidency with the economics and the Bank of the United States, and it's going to allow him to purchase Louisiana. So after the Louisiana Purchase is made official and the United States has now doubled in size, the problem is that nobody really knows what's out there. There has not been that much charted territory. Many Europeans have not made their way out there except for a few French that were fur traders. So the U.S. needs to figure out what in the heck they just bought. So Jefferson is going to send Lewis and Clark out to explore the Louisiana Territory. And you can see on the map here, they're going to start on the Mississippi River in St. Louis, and they're going to travel westward and northward to go through and figure out what in the heck did we just buy. And they even go even a little bit farther, all the way to the west coast Pacific Ocean in present-day Washington, Oregon, and they're going to figure out what is going on out here in the new frontiersland. And what they're going to find is that there's a huge abundance of natural resources and land that would be beneficial for the boost or the boom of the United States economically and also population-wise, because now you can move out westward to expand and get away from that tyrannical government in Washington that the Democratic Republicans are afraid of. Meanwhile, what's going on in Washington is quite a little bit of a controversy between two men, Alexander Hamilton on the left and then Aaron Burr on the right. Now, the reason why there's an issue with this is because with the election of 1800, so with the election of 1800, we talked before about how the election between Jefferson and Adams went down to the wire, and Aaron Burr, who was also running, was on the election ballot for vice president. And when the election came down to a final decision, he was also pushing for the presidency, even though he was a Democratic Republican as well. And ironically, even though Alexander Hamilton was not a fan of Thomas Jefferson, he staunchly believed that Aaron Burr was an evil, evil man. And he was the last one to cast a ballot or to make sure that the representatives in the Senate did not allow Aaron Burr, to be elected over Jefferson. And Burr felt like he was cost the election because of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton called out Burr's morals and character as a man. Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel. Both of them enacted in this duel where they line up and they turn around and shoot at each other. Hamilton was fatally shot, and Burr was not, and Hamilton ends up dying the next day. Burr will eventually be run out of D.C. and his life in politics will be forever gone, and he will seek refuge in, I believe, in Louisiana, near modern, like New Orleans, modern-day Louisiana State.